In the previous slides, we've taken a look at recording data within SharePoint 2010 and how to access this data. There are a lot of alternative data storage considerations that we should touch on just to make sure that you've covered all your bases. You don't have to store everything in SharePoint, and you often have very complex lines of business applications that are held with outside of SharePoint. It may be a good idea for you to integrate these with SharePoint, and you can go and pull the data directly from their data source and bring it up into KPIs or dashboards within SharePoint. That's an option. Alternatively, it is also a good idea to maybe move your UI into SharePoint and actually bring your data closer to, let's say, all your SharePoint data. And these points that we discuss here will really cover points that I feel that are salient for you to migrate your business into SharePoint more directly. So firstly, I'm really looking at SQL Server in the first 2 points. You can build your applications in SQL Server. I'm sure you have a lot of good applications in SQL Server. Now, you can use BCS, which is mentioned in point 3, which is your business connectivity services, to go and grab data directly out of your databases and pop it up onto dashboards for your management or whoever needs it. And you can even use SharePoint for building applications as you do in normal .NET development, where you have your 3 tiers, let's say a business object layer, UI layer, and your data access layer, and you have your database, obviously. You can continue using that technique, especially for your complex applications. I would actually suggest you do that, and you can also do a hybrid of using SQL Server and SharePoint lists to get the most out of SharePoint. So in the top point here, I'm talking about link to SQL. So you could actually go and create a new entity relationship diagram and generate your link to SQL proxy off that, and then you would actually have your mapping between your .NET code and your actual SQL database to go and work with it. And you could go and create a very nice application that doesn't use SharePoint lists at all and just stores the data externally. Obviously now, your storage for this new application is within another database, and you have to make sure that's part of your backup strategy and it's not within SharePoint. But that is a very valid way of building things, and likewise you could use the entity framework, which I find rather odd that Link to SQL has come out from Microsoft and the entity framework, because they seem to cover very similar tasks. I find the entity framework more useful, let's say, for more complex projects, especially the entity framework 4. I really like the entity framework, but for simpler applications, like the one on the right-hand side here is a timesheet entity relationship diagram that I previously had designed that I used for SharePoint. It's a SharePoint 2010 solution. It actually comes from a MOS solution originally. And you can just see there's quite a lot of tables with quite a lot of table line item transactions that you need for creating. So for instance, if you've got multiple clients, you'd have multiple projects. On each of those projects, you need to assign resources to it. Of those resources, you have weekly entries, you have to have time entries for each of those days. So when you actually fill out a timesheet, you probably do 35, 40 odd line entries per week per user you have on a project, or per user really. So you end up with quite a lot of transactions. So originally I built this with SharePoint lists in SharePoint 2010, but I just found that the end data, and because it wasn't transactional, it didn't really work well. So I mean, I just switched out and used this SQL Server as my storage mechanism, and I popped Link to SQL over it rather. And you can continue building this. So the nice thing now is you could actually go and build a timesheet application as a .NET developer, as you've done previously for many years and successfully. And you just hook it into SharePoint. You've got all SharePoint security, but you've now got these server controls that actually would actually offer up the timesheet to everyone. And obviously, using this technique, you could eventually integrate all your back-end screens. But pretty nice, you could get it out and going quite quickly. So as I've mentioned, Entity Framework and Link to SQL do obviously very similar functions at times. I quite like Link to SQL, I'd say, as my preferred supplier. It really does depend on your project. They really do cover the same sort of area for me. We've spoken briefly about the Business Connectivity Services, which is your replacement to your Business Data Catalog, which is BDC. BDC was a lot harder to work with. You can use it obviously on SQL Server, and you can use it on web services and .NET classes as well, actually. So it's a fairly comprehensive way of getting at data, and you can create these external content types. So SharePoint actually sees it as lists, and it'll work in live. So if you had, let's say, a database, it's the simplest example to work with, and you had an application already running on it, if you changed data, let's say you through your application, you were now looking at it in SQL, in SharePoint, you'd see the change in live time and vice versa. So you could just connect to the same backend database with a new UI, and it would all look like it's part of SharePoint. A point to note is you can't use a link to SharePoint with external content types, so you couldn't actually generate the proxies over that code. We've spoken obviously about web services and integrating your lines of business, so you can quite easily integrate with the Windows Communication Framework and web services, and you can internalize that data for your SharePoint users using business connectivity services. And obviously you can program directly against any web service or anything like a normal .NET application using server controls or any code that you implement. Next, I'm going to take a look at remote blob storage. So you often have a lot of blobs that you store within a database or inside a SharePoint database. So we're talking here about images and documents, especially documents. I mean, if you think about a document, now SharePoint, when it stores data in lists and you've got versioning on it, it actually takes another copy. It's not a sort of a beta copy or it's not just a change copy as you would, let's say, have in a source control system. So if you had a document with 30 changes in and it's 1 megabyte every single version, you've now got a lot of data in your database. SQL was never designed to store a blob storage. It's more for row items. So it can get very big, and your content databases, which we talk about hopefully if we've got time at the end, get extremely big, and you don't want to fill it up with blob storage. So in really big applications where you're getting to that 200 gigabyte content database, a good idea would be to implement remote blob storage and ship it off out onto the cloud somewhere or the internet. And most of these companies offer providers that will store your blob storage for you. It's a lot cheaper than storing it within SQL. You reduce the size of your content database, get your backups down to a nice time, and you've got more core data that's on site, let's say, and data such as streaming movies and big image documents, and that can be moved off. So your content database can easily drop 85% of its storage capacity and make working with it really nice. You don't end up with millions of content databases that you have to keep managing and making sure they have the correct size, and you can back them up within time when you're doing your backup, depending on your backup strategy. So that really gives you an idea of blob storage. We've briefly spoken about the cloud, and then obviously Azure. Azure is Microsoft's SQL Server on the cloud. You could write applications and store data in Azure. I generally wouldn't do that on an on-site application because I feel you've already got SQL and you've already got obviously your SharePoint on site. So I wouldn't advise using Azure for storage on the cloud. But if you've got a lot of line item data, it could be a valid option to use it. Ultimately, you just have to look at the security around that, which is actually very nice to get around. You can obviously use file systems to store things. You just need to be a little careful when you have file systems, because if you are relying on data that's on your web front-end servers, every single server has to be the same. So if you are going to deploy it, it's best that something goes out via a feature, so it's automatically pushed onto every front-end web server. Not really an ideal choice. Saying that, you can actually store remote blob storage on your file server, so it's a lot cheaper because you obviously have, you probably have RAID on your 10 on your web front-end servers, but it's a lot cheaper than storing it in SQL databases, and can actually be more performant as well. XML can be stored within lists inside SharePoint, so you've got to just think of that. There's good options, those are your options that are available to you. You just need to decide on the best, and just because you have SharePoint doesn't mean everything has to go into SharePoint or come through SharePoint, but it is a good integration platform. In this slide, we look specifically at generating the link to SharePoint proxy, and you do this using the SPMetal.exe tool. So you have the tool to generate your proxy classes, which generates your link to SharePoint code, which you can then use programmatically that you can call. So you can either use SharePoint's SPMetal.exe, which is held within the root directory, otherwise known as the 14 hive, within the bin folder, and you just open up your command prompt, navigate down to the appropriate place, or you can just call it remotely, obviously, from wherever you are, and run the SPMetal command. And there's quite a lot of parameters, extensions you can add to the call, commands you can add into the call, and so you tell it which website you want to run against, because you're running specifically against a site collection. You can tell it if you want it in C# or VB. And then there's a parameters file, which we'll discuss in a minute, along with all the syntax and parameters. So this will just generate you a nice strongly typed classes, which is your API, which you can then work against for your list data and call the data you want. So looking at the syntax, you just call SPMetal. You can add the executable exe if you want. You specify the site collection that you're interested in, and you can give it in C#. And the parameters file now is very important. By default, what SPMetal generates is it'll generate any field type, so that's any site column that is found within the SharePoint Foundation's 2010 edition. So you don't get any of the more advanced types, so such as the publishing fields. And then also the hidden fields. Only two fields are shown by default, and that's the ID field and the version field. I don't know why they chose the version field, because that doesn't seem that common to me, but you don't see things like who it was last modified by, the modified date, created date, and the attachments that you normally get on lists. So there's a lot of hidden fields that you don't see, or built-in fields. You only get the default SharePoint 2010 Foundations edition fields are shown within there. So using this parameters file, you can actually go and tell the file to show more like the hidden fields, and you can also tell it which lists to show. So you might actually want to only generate on certain of the lists that you have within your site collection. So the parameters file is very useful and should be set up accordingly, but I'm just going to assume for now that you're just leaving the parameters file as it is. And you can actually see one of my slashes in the example there refers to /namespace, and then my namespace is pullback.sp2010.bol for business object layer. It doesn't matter. Obviously, it's just quite nice if you generate it with the right namespace, as you can just go and put the file directly into your Visual Studio project. I haven't spoken about CKS Dev extension, which is done by a lot of really good guys in SharePoint, and there's a lot of good contributors such as Todd Bleek, who I've mentioned before, and the guy who wrote WSP Builder. He's helped out with a lot of their stuff. It's a really useful tool as a developer. You really should have it. If you've got Visual Studio, you've got to put CKS Dev on it. There's just so many useful tools. One very small part of CKS Dev is actually to do with SPMetal or link to SharePoint. And what you can actually do is run this SPMetal command in effect on the base of your site collection through your Solution Explorer. I don't know if we'll have time to have a look at that, but in effect this would actually generate the entire. It's the same as running SPMetal, but it does it and adds it directly into your code within your Visual Studio project. There is a little nuance with integrating into TFS or any source control system. You just need to look at how that gets added, but it can be overcome. So yeah, it is quite flexible, and we'll have a look at that in a minute.